So now we have reached the final phase of Doña Gracia's wanderings, and her last settlement, her last resting place, is Constantinople. Here's where the full feather of her Jewish life can be expressed as she finally takes the role of leadership in the Sephardi world of the Ottoman Empire. And here she can continue all the work she's done until now: the charity, the aid to fugitives from the Iberian Peninsula, her Pidyon Shvuyim efforts, relief to Jewish captives and Jews in distress everywhere in the free world at the time. And she supports Rabbanim, Batei Knesses, throughout the Ottoman Empire. She establishes a yeshiva and a shul in the Ottoman capital, actually a Beit Knesset. The word shul would be anomalous and incorrect to use in the Sephardic world at the time, and it's called the Synagogue of the Senora, La Senora. And in 1559, as the influx of ex-conversos continued, she supports the foundation of yet another synagogue. Meanwhile, Brianda, who had chosen not to leave for Constantinople, remains in Venice with her daughter. And Gracia Nasí and her nephew weren't happy with this arrangement. And Miriam can tell us more about some of the intrigue that happens behind the scenes at this moment, a very difficult and intriguing chapter.
Before Doña Gracia had moved to Constantinople, they had reached some sort of arrangement in that dispute that we spoke about over La Chica, Brianda's daughter's tremendous dowry, and all of the money that was caught up in that dispute. There was some sort of agreement that was arranged, and Doña Gracia was not particularly happy about it. And that means that when her sister stayed behind in Venice with her daughter and she moves to Constantinople, she is not pleased with the situation. And then we have a soap opera story that is so bizarre and so wild because her nephew, Joseph Nasí, arranges, along with his brother, who later becomes known as Shmuel Nasí, to kidnap La Chica, Brianda's daughter, and marry her so that no one else can have access to the dowry. And what's fascinating, first of all, is what was La Chica's reaction? None of the sources seem to suggest that she was particularly upset about it. And Brianda, of course, her mother, was furious, and this whole thing blows up. The Venetian authorities are furious as well, and eventually they're caught. And La Chica is returned to her mother. Joseph, after much to do in Venice, is banished from the city under penalty of death.
Right.
Should he come back, he will be quartered and dismembered and his body parts displayed around the city. And what happens now is equally bizarre. So Doña Gracia is in Constantinople, her niece, sister in Venice. They are going to move, her sister and niece are going to move, but then shortly thereafter, Brianda dies unexpectedly, and Gracia is now an orphan. So a year of mourning takes place for Brianda, and then Shmuel goes and marries. In other words, Joseph's brother marries La Chica, and Joseph himself moves to Constantinople and marries Doña Gracia's daughter, Anna, now known as Reina.
Exactly.
So if you can get your mind around that. Now, of course, the big question is, was there a real marriage in the first place? So many historians think that the whole thing was a sham. It was just a means to get her away from her mother and keep the fortune in the hands of the Nasí family. Others say that even if it was a real marriage, it doesn't matter because halachically it would not be a problem because the Rabbanim did not hold from converso marriages unless there was a chuppah that took place afterwards in the presence of 10 openly Jewish men. Number one. Number two, if you think about it, the Sephardim never accepted the favor of Rabbeinu Gershom. So even if technically you could say he was married, it didn't matter. And that he could have taken Doña Gracia's daughter for a wife. So we now have both Shmuel, two brothers, married to cousins. And now the family is in Constantinople. And as you said, Doña Gracia realizes her full potential there and focuses less on business and more, as you said, all of the mitzvot of Pidyon Shvuyim and tzedakah and setting up schools and so on. And I would also like to point out that she had a very crucial role in developing the city of Salonika.
Right.
And Salonika is another fascinating story in the Ottoman Empire. It's the only city in the world that had a Jewish majority. And she's instrumental in encouraging many of the Anusim who are fleeing Portugal to settle in Salonika.
And in Constantinople, where she is based, she manages to continue to manage the family's commercial and shipping activities. And she has agents all over the world acting on her behalf in the other commercial centers in Europe. So she's establishing her home turf as the hub, basically. And with the cultivation of Salonika and Constantinople, she's really just making sure that she's fortifying this home base so that it can be a successful and fluid and important point of contact for Jews the world over. And Joseph Nasí, who becomes her trusted partner in this enterprise, also secures a powerful place amongst the dignitaries of the time, and particularly Sultan Suleiman. And his wife, Doña Gracia's daughter, Reina, also becomes a forceful figure because she follows in her mother's footsteps in terms of charitable works. But still, Gracia maintains her unique reputation as this embodiment of this powerful, wealthy, influential woman who takes care of her people. And so we can begin to think about her legacy.
When you talk about her power and her influence, this is where she begins to use the name Nasí, which has all sorts of connotations of power. And perhaps she saw herself as ascendant from Malchut Beit David, and the Nisiim, who function as a sort of the president of the Sanhedrin. There's this legacy of Nisiut, and she takes on that title, which she uses here.
So as far as the Nasí name, it's so interesting because almost everything that we've discussed in this podcast was originally historiographized by Cecil Roth and by different historians, and is now being revisited and almost contested by so many different historians that we read about, right? Except for, we're going to discuss soon the sources that they use, which remain uncontested, but which historians like to pit against each other to show the subtleties and the nuances and the differences. One thing that I haven't found debated in any of the literature, even the most contemporary literature, is the grandeur of her actual influence and power. She was it.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen her described as most likely the most powerful woman in all of the Ottoman world at the time. Forget about Jewish women. This was a woman who, if she's reclaiming the title of Nasí, it's perhaps also, as I read, the Nasí name was her original name back from her Spanish forebears. In other words, to really reference her own yichus, so to speak, her own lineage, which is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
She really came into power after her husband passed away.
Right. So Doña Gracia chose Constantinople, as you said, as her final city that she settled and spent the rest of her life there. And it made sense for her to do so because the Counter-Reformation is going on. The Christians are clamping down more and more the conversos. And at the same time, the Ottomans, who run this multinational empire, are actually good to their minorities. And although the minorities in their empire are considered dhimmi and technically second class, they're also protected. And the Ottomans recognized that they could use the Jews and other minorities to develop their economies. And so it made sense for Doña Gracia to come to a place where she could live openly as a Jew, use all of her contacts across the Mediterranean world to increase her trade, and also help her fellow Jews. And remember that the Jews are not the enemies of the Muslims, the Christians are.
At this point.
And so they were sort of neutral and a very helpful element in the Ottoman Empire.
It's so different to us to hear that to modern ears. But when we think about it, as we mentioned in the beginning, that really the most fertile period for the Jews was when they lived under Muslim jurisdiction, and that enabled them to flourish forth for these reasons, for the reasons of permission, freedom, relative freedom, and how that all turned on its head in terms of when the Christian papal state came to power. Mm-hmm. And especially that's a lot what we're dealing with here.
Right.
And what we're going to deal with in Italy shortly.
Right. And especially, you say, given what we look at the world today, the geopolitical world today in relation between Jews and Muslims and Christians and so on, it's very different. But I think it was Sela Baron who said, for most of the Middle Ages and well into the early modern period, better to be a Jew under Islam than a Jew under Christendom. And that certainly was true in the case of Doña Gracia.
Very important to remember. And that's why, in terms of the relationship that Joseph Nasí developed with Sultan Suleiman, it really enables Gracia to go further with her dream and her plan. And she does something very unusual. She acquires land in Tiberia and Tiberias. And here she's considered a proto-Zionist because she's probably the first person in history to fund and encourage Jewish settlement in Israel, independent settlement, if you will, specifically for reasons of creating a Jewish stronghold there. So while they're under and they have to have permissions, of the various governmental powers and sovereignties that exist there, she procures this lease to have rights to rebuild and settle the city. And rebuild it, they did. Tiberias was a ghost town. It was raw and desolate, and Doña Gracia and her nephew and Rabbi Yosef ben Aderes expend great effort to cultivate the topography, the industry, the commerce, in hopes of turning it into a hub of Jewish activity and settlement. And they worked to fortify it, to protect it against insurgents. And until 1564, they were dedicated to this cause. And at that point, they constructed the city's security wall, and it was completed. But as the Jews began their return to Israel, it piqued the interest of the Christians. And it seems that for reasons that are still under kind of a haze of history, these external forces were able to halt the influx of Jews to the city. And that vibrant dream of a center of Jewish life that Gracia invested so much in after a couple of years, and in fact, even I read until the next generation seemed to have dissipated and didn't really come to the fore. But the dream lived on.
It's also interesting, the context, some historians see this when the conversos had this catastrophic expulsion and the persecutions that followed them, there was this messianic speculation in the air that perhaps this was the harbinger of the messianic era. And perhaps we can view some of these activities, resettling Eretz Yisrael, as part of this vision of a better day, a messianic day yet to come. It's also interesting, that when you said building up the industry, they did practical things like try to import the silk industry and plant mulberry bushes and new technologies for making silk in the Galil and Tiberia. And sadly, the effort failed, but it was a valiant effort.
It was a valiant effort, and it left its seeds, even though those mulberry bushes didn't sprout at that point. But it's fascinating to see that Eretz Yisrael is still the center of all kinds of innovations, and being the epicenter of the world as it is, still is ripe for that. And the timing wasn't right. And I think that's so much of you're talking about the messianic fervor that takes place. It's the potential that's there that for some reason doesn't materialize. And we know that that potential lives in every generation for Mashiach to come. So these sparks doubtless were there. And for whatever reason, the generation didn't merit it, but the seeds were sown for future generations.
And I believe there's a Doña Gracia museum in Tiberia, a little museum with dioramas of her life. So
amazing. That's
off the beaten track trip.
Definitely. That's the next trip that we go to Tiberia. That's a great thing to see. I did not know about that. And another amazing, tragic chapter in the life of Doña Gracia and the Jews of her time expresses itself in the Ancona boycott. And we come to this largely forgotten chapter of Jewish history. It's overwhelmed and overshadowed by so many tragedies of greater and wider proportion. One of the fears that I often encounter in my life as a teacher of the Holocaust at the high school level is apprehension that our students will eventually, if it hasn't already happened, that soon the Holocaust will be perceived by our children, our students, as if it were the Spanish Inquisition. That's the phrase that's always bandied about. I don't know if you've heard it, Miriam, so many times. They look at the Holocaust like it's the Spanish Inquisition. And by that, of course, parents, principals, even survivors and children of survivors mean to say that this portion of history will be relegated to the cobwebs of young minds, something dormant, unexplored, so far away, something to think about in reflective sadness, maybe once a year, maybe on Tisha B'Av, but subsumed by all the tragic persecutions that befell our people since the very first Churban, the very first exile. So that overarching framing, now that we're actually recovering the aftershocks of the Spanish Inquisition, it serves to highlight just how far-flung and how distant this subchapter of the Spanish Inquisition is to our collective consciousness as Jewish people, and how much more of a reason to bring it to the forefront, to bring this lesser-known occurrence, this subtopic within the Spanish Inquisition. It's kind of an aftershock, the Ancona boycott, so we're bringing it to the fore as well. We've developed an understanding now of the scope of Doña Gracia's life, her reach, her wealth, and we got to dig into the chapters of her life that are documented in the response of her day. And we can see within this historical episode the difficulties of the time in which Doña Gracia lived, in which Doña Gracia's power clearly emerges. And we can see that she was not only wealthy and influential, but that she thought big. She thought on a political plane. She operated on the world stage by managing financial interests to pressure a political faction and to effect change. Her power wasn't marginal, as we might expect for a woman. It wasn't peripheral, but it was central and primary. And in fact, it's the first time since the biblical era that Jews respond to a situation with a solution outside of shtadlanus or retreat.
So, what's the story? In 1555, a new pope comes to rule. His name is Pope Paul IV. He was a horrible human being. He himself said about himself that he had not done anything good, and he was very puzzled why he was chosen by the cardinals to be pope. But in any case, he was an extremist, and it bothered him so much. Again, remember the context of the Counter-Reformation, conversos all over Europe and Italy, living freely as Jews, and it bothered him to no end. Remember also the Muslims had reached the gates of Vienna, and so he's feeling under attack and he's feeling threatened, and he does something that overturns the precedents that were set by earlier popes. So first, let's talk a little bit about Italy. Italy was not Italy. It was not united. It was a combination of various city-states, each ruled by different dukes and princes or under papal control.
So our story occurred in the city of Ancona, which was a pivotal and central commercial port on the east coast of Italy. It was established as a papal state in 1429, and the popes, actually Clement III and Paul III, tried to develop Ancona as a center of international trade. To achieve this goal, they granted the city's Jews permission to open banks and offer credit. And in 1547, the Pope invited anyone from the kingdoms of Portugal, including new Christians. So obviously an open invitation to the Jews to settle in Ancona. With this type of encouragement, as we might imagine, conversos from Portugal and Spain begin to settle in Ancona. And it was geographically poised to achieve that status as an important port within the Ottoman Empire. But everything changes in 1555 when a new pope, Paul IV, takes office in the Vatican. And he's known for his undisguised anti-Semitic feelings and turns against the Jewish population of Ancona, ignores all the rights granted to Jews by the popes that preceded him. They were humiliated, deprived of their commercial privileges, locked up in a ghetto, and the Pope reinstates the Inquisition once again in Ancona. He confiscates the property of the Jews and he begins to persecute and condemn the conversos. Nearly 100 conversos were imprisoned by the Inquisition. Others were deprived of their liberty to be sold on the Maltese slave market. 24 conversos who had lived openly as Jews refused conversion and they were burnt at the stake.
Even before the conversos were condemned to be burned, Doña Gracia got involved by receiving an audience with Suleiman the Magnificent, and then she gets him to write a letter to the Pope, a very strongly worded letter, in which she says, we have Christians living here in Constantinople in my empire. You had better treat my subjects well and release them. The Pope does not back down. He says, we will only release those people that we can prove were Levantine subjects and their properties. Everybody else is under arrest and will be condemned to death. And that's exactly what happened. And Doña Gracia is so furious that she now goes along with an idea that had been suggested by some of the conversos, which was to punish the Pope. And as you said, Spar, this is a pivotal moment in Jewish history. We're no longer turning to bribery or shtadlanos or fleeing. We are going to show the Pope that Jewish blood does not come cheap. And so this initial idea has received a lot of enthusiasm, especially amongst the converso merchants. We're going to move our business away from Ancona. We're going next door to Pizarro, where the Duke of Pizarro had promised freedoms and he would build the port and so on. And it looked like the boycott was going to be this successful first attempt to punish the Goyim and again show them that Jewish blood does not come cheap. But then it all falls apart because a number of the rabbis who approached, who initially were in favor of the boycott, and here is where Tzipori would mention so often that one of the important sources that we have for this period of history are Shelot and Shuvot, and the shut on this subject is absolutely fascinating. One of the rabbis who was deeply involved was Yoshua Cincino, who was from the famous Italian printing family, but originally all the way back when from Germany. She had left Christian Europe and settled in Constantinople, and he's actually one of the rabbis, as you mentioned. She subsidizes rabbis and pays for their activities and pays for shuls and publishing their books. She has a very close relation with Doña Gracia. And nevertheless, after receiving complaints from the native Jews of Ancona, and here we should stop and just say something about the Jewish population in Italy. You have Ashkenazim who had fled persecution who went to Italy. You have the native Italian Jews who are neither Sephardic nor Ashkenazim, but have been there since Korban Beit HaMikdash and maybe even earlier. And they're coming now and they're saying, wait a minute, if you boycott us, our business is going to be hurt. Moreover, what could the Pope do to us? Who knows how he'll come down on us?
Right.
And Joshua Cincino says, wait a minute, he takes a step back. And in his Nachla Leoshua, in his book of Shelot and Shuvot, he has some very strongly worded responsa condemning the conversos and saying, he even says, I would put in chayrim anyone who moves from a Christian country, escapes persecution in Portugal and moves to a Christian country. Oh no, you have to come to the Muslim world where you can live freely. So he's defending the native Jews. He's suggesting that conversos are doing things perhaps incorrectly for commercial reasons, for reasons that they want to hold on to their wealth, and they are endangering other Jews. And he does not back down. Even when Doña Gracia demands an audience with him, he refuses to go along, and eventually the boycott falls apart.
This is a very controversial moment in Jewish history where we see that even though Doña Gracia was poised to have this political clout, it wasn't necessarily backed up by the Rabbanim or by the people involved in the actual story. So it wasn't enough. It wasn't sufficient to have the entree and the ear of these politicians, the political leaders rather. You needed to have the support of the people on the ground.
Joshua Cincino is just one rabbinic voice here, maybe the most prominent one involved in this dispute, but there were other rabbis that supported the boycott. So you had the split. And what's fascinating, I teach the subject to my students, and I always do a survey. After we talk about the Ancona boycott, I have the students vote. Would you vote for the boycott or not? And it's interesting to see how the split parallels a split that you see at the time as well. And it's a big question. It's a thought experiment. If the boycott had succeeded, could this have sent a message for generations to come? Or do we have to take into account Kol Yisrael Erevim Zeh Lazeh? And if you're going to punish someone and in the process hurt other Jews, is it worth it? And, you have parallels even in the Nazi era.
Absolutely.
In the 30s, when there was a boycott suggested against Germany, similar issues and questions arose. So it's a tough question, and I don't know what the answer is. When you read Cecil Roth, the great biographer of Doña Gracia, he's still so mad at the rabbis. And he still says, she was a hero and they were cowards, but perhaps it's not so simple. And these are questions that we need to wrestle with.
Absolutely. If you read the later scholarship, there's a woman named Ruth Lamdan who has done amazing work on this topic, who takes a lesser view of Doña Gracia's role and her intentions. So it's a teku question. And I think part of this discord and dissonance that we're feeling and seeing in terms of political clout versus shtadlanut, it's also part of the galus. It's also part of this ability to understand that we really are not in control, that there is no one decisive way until Mashiach will come and free us. And all of these machinations and attempts really cannot lead us to an ultimate unfulfilling answer, because we aren't going to be at peace until that moment comes. So it's always just interesting to see that we think that the Yeshua can come. We think that the redemption can come, if only, if only, if only. The answer is not so clear. The only clarity that we'll have is really when we'll have that eternal redemption. Mirza Hashem soon. But what's fascinating now is that we can look at, as you mentioned, as I mentioned, that we get to dig into the chapters of Doña Gracia's life that are documented in the responsa literature of her day. And one of the things that is so interesting about this body of literature, Shelos Utshuvos, is that their halachic chidushim, their novel interpretations of Gemara and Rishonim, are manifest within their answers. In Doña Gracia's case, it was her dual marriage ceremonies, both Portuguese and Jewish, that would later rock the Jewish world of rabbinic thought, when Gracia and her sister Brianda both lay claim to the inheritance of the Mendez fortune. As we mentioned, 8 years after their marriage, Francisco dies, leaving Gracia a widow with one daughter, Reina. In his will, Francisco bequeaths half of his assets to his brother, Diego Mendez Benaviste, who ultimately marries Brianda, Gracia's sister. A few short years later, Diego passes away as well. And here's where it gets complicated. She demands her portion of that original inheritance from Francisco to Diego. Brianda was expecting a windfall, but Gracia insisted that Brianda's portion was less than she might have hoped, since all that Diego could have inherited in total from Francisco was the wealth remaining after the mandatory sums were allocated to his widow and his daughter. And of that remainder, Francisco only gave away half to Diego, which of his entire fortune amounted to a much smaller percentage. Brianda countered this claim by stating that once we're disputing inheritances, Gracia herself should not even inherit at all as a woman according to Din Torah, because an almana is not an automatic heir. But here's where Gracia held that the law of the land, in this case, the Catholic marriage laws of Portugal, were the ones that were legally binding according to Dina de Malchusa Dina. The sisters approached the courts with this dispute in Vienna, and at the same time, the question went out to all of the greatest poskim, the Maharashtam, Rabbi Moshe Mitrani, the Mabit, the Mahari Ben Lev, and all of them supported Doña Gracia's position, establishing that when dealing with monetary laws, the law of the land is followed. And since legally Gracia was Francisco's wife, she inherits accordingly. On the other hand, Rav Yosef Karo disagrees, finding that marriage outside of halacha has no bearing. There's no action of kinyan there, and therefore it doesn't exist as a marriage at all. You can hear a full treatment and reading of the Shalos Utshuvos, the responsa literature itself, in our mini-pod, which you can find in our show notes, with a discussion and interpretation of the psak on Gracia's inheritance. So all in all, it is clear that Gracia was a unique character in history, not only Jewish history, but history writ large. She's a woman who amassed great wealth and great power. She lived life as a secret Jew, and she risked her life as a secret Jew so many times in order to come to a safer and more wholesome place to live her life in the open as a Jew. And she emerged triumphant. She contested the desires of kings. She protected her people at great cost. She supported and facilitated not only the printing of the Torah and the study of Torah in formalized yeshivos, but she also invested in the future of the Jewish nation and homeland.
Which is why, given everything you said, the big question that we should really raise is, given everything that she's done and her importance for Jewish history, why was she forgotten until the 20th century? It seems so unjust and it seems so puzzling. Why did the memory of this great woman not survive and was only resurrected, if you will, in the 20th century?
It's such an interesting question And I think the question, as we began, about the marginalization of stories that really were so frontal and so important, juxtaposing it with the Sephardic history and the golden age, we're listening now to all of the luminaries of Sephardic history that have come forth just within this past little while that we've been speaking, that still light up the pages of yeshivos the world over. But in terms of our own understanding and consciousness of Jewish history, they don't appear in the forefront. Things have been overshadowed by numbers, by time. But I'm so glad and grateful for the opportunity to bring these stories to the fore once again.
I would also add that on a more pragmatic level, but so sadly and tragically, neither she nor her sister had any descendants. There were no grandchildren. Both of their daughters were childless. And so the family vanishes. And it's only the 20th century would add something else to the study of Jewish history in general, bringing the biographies of great Jewish women and men back to life is something that you see beginning really in the 19th century. And so for hundreds of years, the study of Jewish history was not in the forefront of intellectual Jewish activity. And so that might be part of the answer as to why we don't know so much about Doña Gracia until the modern period. And another interesting point that somebody raised is that her fame rests, we don't usually see biographies of business people. The idea that you celebrate someone who was famous for her great wealth is a little bit unusual. And that might be a reason why we celebrate great artists and thinkers and philosophers and so on. But if you think about what Doña Gracia is famous for, the chasadim that she did for the Jewish community, all those activities that you mentioned, but primarily because she was a wealthy woman. And that in itself is not necessarily something that historically we celebrated.
You're saying Gevir culture is a new phenomenon.
Yes, it is. It absolutely is.
That's something that's just a very interesting point to ponder in terms of women's histories or in terms of intellectual histories. This is another instance of where intellectual histories and elitist histories still prevail, where we do have the written word, where we do have the responsa, and that's kind of all that we have. And the personalities or the figures that our eyes are trained on today, influencers, so to speak, played much less of a part. It was what you could write down and pass on and transmit. And so now this is being recorded.
And then I would also add something else, that the ambivalence about conversos is also present. The conversos were very often received with suspicion by the native Jewish communities, and there's not necessarily a celebration. Doña Gracia, yes, but the conversos in general were not necessarily celebrated or written about. They were a problem for a lot of Jewish communities.
Yep.
And maybe that would also explain in part the reticence that we have outside of Shelos Chuvos, perhaps. I don't know. Oh, you know what else, Sephora, which was so interesting? It's so amazing to see that when another case came up with Doña Gracia, and she appeared before Joshua in a Din Torah regarding the inheritance, he actually ruled in her favor. And we talked about how Rabbanim, when they're great Rabbanim, they judge each case on its individual merits. It's not as if he was biased against Doña Gracia.
Right.
And in another case that involved an inheritance dispute, he took her side. Nevertheless, in the Ancona boycott, he took the other side. Each case was adjudicated on its merits based on his perspective.
It's a wonderful point about the impartiality of the halachic process.
Right. And that's something we should point out. That's not a personal thing. It's not that he said, I don't like Doña Gracia and I think you're wrong and you're arrogant and so on. In this case, I think you're wrong. But in the other case, he ruled in her favor, which was so interesting.
That's a wonderful point. And now, let's lift the veil. Leaving aside our intellectual legacies and our intellectual conversation for a moment, let's talk woman to woman, and let's find out the secrets, some of your magical secrets that you managed to achieve in the part of your life that's domestic and motherly, maternal, and all of that. We want to know about your background and who you are behind the scenes. Can you share your favorite book or your favorite author?
That's like asking, which is my favorite child? You're a reader, so you know how difficult that would be. But you know what I would do? I would say that since we're discussing Sephardic history, I would focus on some of my favorite books in that genre. I happen to love mysteries and thrillers. That's like one of my favorite genres when I want to relax with curl up with a good mystery or thriller. Oh my goodness, yum. But I would highly recommend for any readers who love a good mystery and a nonfiction one at that, Mati Friedman's book on the Aleppo Codex. It's so fabulous. It reads like a true life thriller. We assign that in our Sephardic history class, and my students absolutely go crazy. It should be made into a Mishpacha serial.
I'm surprised that you assign it because it touched off some.
Yes, just to whet the listener's appetite. It's a very controversial book because of its conclusion. Those of you who are interested, the Aleppo Codex is the most important and most accurate and most beautiful version of a early version of the Torah book, written as a codex. And Rambam himself testified to how perfect that text is. And the question is, what happened to the Aleppo Codex once it is smuggled out of Syria? And I'm not going to give it away because you have to read the book, but the conclusion is very controversial and it's still being debated today. He's subsequently done further research and only strengthened his thesis, which is fascinating. I also love the novels and stories of Reb Chaim Sabato, who is a Rosh Yeshiva and a novelist. And his books have been translated to English, and especially if anybody's interested in Sephardic history, and in particular the history of the Syrian community, his book Aleppo Tales, which is a trilogy of likely fictionalized stories about a Jewish family in Aleppo. There's another book, The Dawning of the Day, which is one of the most lyrical, gorgeous books you can possibly read in Hebrew, and it's also been translated into English. So those are my favorites in the genre of Sephardic literature.
Such amazing choices.
They're fabulous. I also love memoirs, and I think one of the most memorable books, and again, something that students really enjoy, sometimes they assign parts of it in our Holocaust classes, is the one by Rabbi Yisrael, the former chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, Out of the Depths, which is so beautiful and so inspiring and so fabulous.
What is your most beloved historical era to teach? Do you have one? This is another one of those favorites.
I do. I do. So we started the podcast by pointing out, even though I'm Ashkenaz, my favorite subject to teach is Sephardic history. But I also love teaching, believe it or not, Hasidut. My family on my mother's side is Satmar, and it's something that I was always intrigued by. I didn't really necessarily grow up Hasidish, but we certainly have Hasidish minhagim. I grew up in Borough Park, and I find it fascinating to be teaching an overwhelmingly Sephardic class about Hasidus, and the students really relate. There are so many fabulous ideas that resonate with them, and I think that Hasidut had so much to teach. It's very much a part of the contemporary Jewish scene, and when I tell students, when I show them that Hasidus and Hasidic ideas have so much to contribute to the way they live, and just going on a Shabbaton and having a kumzitz and learning the ideas about dveikus and so on, it really resonates. So that's another favorite subject that I like to teach.
Tell us about what you love to do in your spare time.
So in my spare time, I'm generally not reading books. That I will save that for at night or on breaks at work. I love anything that involves movement. I love sports. I am a big runner, an avid cyclist, an ice skater in the winters, and I love tennis. So that's what I do in my spare time.
Fantastic. That might be the secret to so much of the energy that comes through every time we have a conversation. It's always overflowing with ebullience and with vibrancy. And it just, you feel the movement even when you're sitting down.
Right. I think part of it also has to do with the fact that I grew up in a family. I was the only girl with 3 brothers who were what my grandmother used to call Vildachayas. So I quickly had to learn how to outrun and outhit them all.
Well, then you had to take on these roles, these feminine roles, which you also excel at so amazingly. So can you share one hostess magic trick? Like, how do you pull that rabbit out of the hat at home, whether it's a recipe or a guest room hack, or what's your little go-to to make your people feel special? Like, what's your thing?
That's a tough one. I have one fun thing. We have on every Yontif when we have company, and especially my grandchildren love this, but my guests also, we have something called the mystery soup course, where I make a soup with like interesting or exotic ingredients, and you get a prize. You get like double dessert or a special treat if you can guess what the ingredients are in that mystery soup. But in general, I like to make a colorful table with lots of salads.
What's your favorite salad?
My favorite salad is one that I just invented. It's like our favorite family recipe. I roast carrots and shiitake mushrooms in the oven with lots of spices. And then I serve that with a honey mustard dressing and also roasted chickpeas. And now they have all this great pre-washed lettuce and craisins, the 50% less sugar craisins, and the cucumber, little Persian cucumber chopped up, and a little honey mustard and some nuts, some pumpkin seeds, and it's out of this world.
This sounds magical to me.
It's very good. Yeah. It's, by the way, so much fun. I literally have I have a special chocolate bar.
What ingredients?
Usually it has to be a blended soup, but it could be, let's say, parsnip or wild mushrooms or something that you wouldn't necessarily pick up on. And we actually have one guest that comes every year, Sukkot, at night. And I'm already running out of options. I'm going crazy.
I have a soup for you.
Okay, good.
I just made for Yontif ridiculously this pumpkin soup, which is not really seasonal,
yeah,
from Celebrate Cookbook, and it has cookies inside.
Okay, that definitely wins.
It really calls for amaretto cookies, but who sells kosher amaretti cookies? I don't know.
Right. So the last one I did was like a wild mushroom and chestnut. It was hard to distinguish, but I have a guest with a very, very sophisticated, refined palate, and he almost always gets it, and he got it. So
he will not get this.
Okay, I need that recipe.
I will send it to you. This is definitely going to be a winner. I'm so excited. Selo Baron famously refuted what we as Frum Jews might relate to as the lachrymose conception of Jewish history. When we talk about our past as a people, there's so much persecution, so much sadness, so much displacement, and so much angst. But Miriam, you're full of this upbeat energy and positivity. What do you draw that from?
So maybe I can answer that question with a personal anecdote. I just got back from a trip with my class to Spain, Morocco, and Gibraltar. And our first stop in Spain was the city of Toledo, which is absolutely magnificent. Outside the walls of the old city, you have a statue of Isabella. Isabella, who threw us out. And our tour guide, some of you might know her, Sheila Schwabel, who's an amazing tour operator, stood in front of the statue. And she quoted the story of a great rabbi who went to the Arch of Titus, I think it was Rabbi Kalmanowitz from the Mir, and who said, Titus, Titus, Eifo ata, maybe he said in Yiddish, where are you? Sheila Schwabel stood up and said, Isabella, Isabella, where are you? Anachnu po. And really, that's the answer. We're here. You're not.
Amazing. The triumph of survival.
The triumph of survival. And I would also add the most beautiful thing that I ever heard as a student of Jewish history. When I first started teaching in Flatbush, this is like my favorite Var Torah in Jewish history. It's amazing. When I first started teaching in Flatbush, I had to hire teachers. I was chairman of the department, and I hired a young man by the name of Chacham Salim Dweck. He tragically died very young, but he was a brilliant up-and-coming scholar. He was so brilliant, much smarter than I was, and it was embarrassing that I was his boss. And because he was computer literate, I asked him to type up some Jewish history timelines. And he gave me this beautiful booklet. This is the beginning of the era of computers. And on each page, he wrote, we taught in Hebrew at the time, he wrote Historia Kita Yud Aleph, and he spelled Historia this way, Hey Yud Samach, Taf Vav Resh Yud Hey.
Wow.
And I was so excited to give it back to little Schadenfreude. And I said, Chacham Dweck, we can't give this out because you made a very basic mistake, because Hebrew was much better than mine. I wrote, everybody knows Historia is a milah lo azid, and it's with a tet and not a tuf. So he says, no. He smiled at me. He says, no. I learned a beautiful lesson from Rav Kook. Rav Kook would write the word Historia with a tuf. Why? So I asked my students, what do you see in the word Historia with a tuf? Seter ka, the hidden hands of God. And that's really the answer to your question, that the hidden hands of God, you look at Jewish history, and that's why to me Jewish history is one of the most spiritual activities that a Jew can do, because you see the hidden hands of God orchestrating events and bringing us to the point where we can say, Anachnu po, despite all the vicissitudes of Jewish life, we are still here. And there's no other explanation for it but Seter ka, Yad Hashem.
I think that's the most beautiful lesson that you could have left us with. And the fact that you are here, Miriam Wielgus, to reveal the hidden hand of Hashem throughout history with us today was immeasurably wonderful. And I'm so grateful that you joined us. And I know that all our listeners will be as well.
Tzipora, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. And having this conversation with you really enlightened me to many aspects of Doña Gracia's life, and especially the Shelot and Shuvot response to discussion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Veiled Reference. Enjoy this episode and share it with your friends. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you at podcasts@mishpacha.com. Veiled Reference, a Mishpacha podcast.